Italy's military and political elite faced three options in 1943: defeat on the battlefield, the threat of Bolshevism, or capitulation and German enslavement. However, to avoid any of these outcomes, soldiers and politicians pursued a collaborative partnership with the Allies to preserve the parliamentary system of monarchy. Mussolini, the man whom they had followed to a dead end, fell on July 25, 1943. His successor, Marshal Badoglio, kept the move hidden from senior officials and worked to preserve a false image, one where Italy was still part of the Axis powers. Eisenhower's declaration of the armistice terms, however, later forced his hand. As a result, he and the king departed Rome, leaving the populace and armed forces at the mercy of the Germans. Italy's campaign in the Second World War, also known as the Liberation of Italy, involved Allied and Axis operations from 1943 to 1945. In 1943, the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada joined forces to invade the island of Sicily. The underlying aim of the attacks was to eliminate Italy from the war. It was enacted on July 9th and became known as Operation Husky. The initial plan for the attack was to land in the northwest, south, and southeast areas of the island, as it would help capture key Axis airfields and the main ports on the island. The Allied believed such attack tactics would allow them to rapidly build up Allied forces and deny key areas to the Axis powers. However, the plan was later changed to a limited number of landings. The forces that invaded Sicily included the U.S. 7th Army under Lieutenant General George S. Patton, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, the 1st Canadian Armored Brigade under Major General Guy Simons, and the British 8th Army under General Bernard Montgomery. So, the invasion of Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky, wasn't just a single beach landing. It was a thoroughly planned, multi-pronged attack with the aim of cracking open the door to mainland Italy. On July 9, 1943, the Allied forces stormed the southern shores of Sicily at the Gulf of Gila. The initial plan was that the British would swiftly advance north along the east coast, with Canadians holding the center and Americans flanking the left. However, the rugged Sicilian terrain proved to be a tough challenge for the Allies, with mountains slowing down British progress. Hence, there was a much-needed change of plan that came in the form of General George Patton and his American 7th Army. Instead of sticking to the script, Patton launched a bold westward push before swinging northward in a daring maneuver to cut off the northern coastal road. This audacious move proved to be a game-changer in the invasion of Sicily as it bottled up German forces. Now, the Americans were in pole position to race for the crucial city of Messina. Messina was located at the northeastern tip of Sicily and held immense strategic significance. It served as a gateway to mainland Italy, with a narrow strait separating it from Calabria. Controlling Messina meant controlling this key passage for Axis forces to potentially retreat from Sicily. Hence, Patton and his American 7th Army knew they had to act fast if they were to gain the upper hand in the battle for Sicily. Hence, the Americans launched a westward push to capture the capital of Sicily, the town of Palermo. Having successfully captured Palermo, Patton did not stop. He then executed a sharp turn north, aiming to sever the crucial coastal road Route 113 near Brolo. Now, the German forces retreating westward were trapped. Although the Americans were now in a prime position to capture Messina, there was an internal rift between Patton and British General Bernard Montgomery, who led the 8th Army. The British were struggling with the challenging terrain and facing stiffer German resistance, and they could not keep pace with the ever-ambitious and aggressive Patton. The final leg of the race to Messina was a frantic one, with the American troops facing exhaustion and dwindling supplies on their way towards the city. On August 17, 1943, Americans became the first Allied forces to enter the city of Messina. This victory, however, came at a cost. Even though Patton's gamble paid off, the United States suffered more casualties as a result of its bolder strategy than the British did. The capture of Messina marked the end of organized Axis resistance in Sicily. While most German forces managed to escape through the Strait of Messina, the island was firmly in Allied hands. This victory, achieved through a daring maneuver and fierce competition, became a turning point in the war. Not only did it provide the Allied powers with a crucial base for the invasion of Italy, but it also exposed the vulnerabilities of the Axis forces. The conquest of Sicily was one of the largest amphibious operations of World War II, with over 150,000 Allied troops taking part in the invasion. The immediate impact of the invasion of Sicily was catastrophic for Italy and the Axis powers. The successful invasion undermined public support for the Italian fascist regime and raised opposition. As a result, on July 25, 1943, just weeks after the invasion had begun, Benito Mussolini was deposed and arrested. Furthermore, this invasion dramatically changed German strategy, and they were compelled to focus their attention and resources on defending Italy rather than the Eastern Front. In the end, this made them less formidable opponents of the Soviet Union. Last but not least, with Mussolini gone, the new Italian government under King Victor Emmanuel III began secret negotiations with the Allies. On September 3, 1943, an armistice was signed between the Allies and the new Italian regime. But the worst was yet to come, something so monumental that it would shake the cores of Italy and Europe forever. After a successful invasion of Sicily, the Allied forces were in pole position to begin their invasion of mainland Italy. One of the initial operations in the invasion of mainland Italy was Operation Baytown, spearheaded by the British Eighth Army's 8 Corps under the command of Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey. This campaign aimed to target the southern tip of the Italian mainland and the city of Calabria. Here, Allied forces encountered a far different reception than they would face further north. Italian forces, aware of their nation's surrender negotiations, offered little resistance. To the surprise of General Montgomery, this was a swift and bloodless victory. German forces had left only token resistance in Calabria as they anticipated the main assault to take place in Salerno. Hence, they put up 8 divisions to defend a far more important part of mainland Italy. Although the victory came easy and without many bullets being fired, the path forward for the British Army proved anything but smooth. The unforgiving Calabrian terrain, riddled with demolished bridges, roadblocks, and mines, severely hampered their progress. The lack of open battlefields meant there was no room for bypass maneuvers. Every obstacle became a real bottleneck as the Allied engineers had to work tirelessly to clear the path. Montgomery had already questioned the viability of this operation, and this struggle against the terrain and obstacles only validated his concerns about the effectiveness of this operation. As the British struggled with the terrain, the German High Command didn't sit idle. General Tregeau-Eyre's 76th Panzer Corps, concentrated near Castrovillari, formed a corps defensive force. In Taranto, the battle-hardened 1st Parachute Division stood guard. Further north, General Hermann Balck's 14th Panzer Corps stood as a defensive force, with the 16th Panzer Division, the elite Hermann Göring Division, and the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division positioned near Salerno, Naples, and Gaeta, respectively. German plans to defend Italy against the Allied invasion saw a massive hit on September 8th when the Italian surrender was publicly announced. Italian troops across the peninsula stopped their campaigns and sailed their navy boats to surrender at Allied-controlled ports. However, the Germans had anticipated this betrayal, so they moved quickly to disarm the Italian units and occupy strategically important positions. Another key operation in the mainland invasion of Italy was carried out further north at Taranto. Unlike Operation Baytown in Calabria, where Allied forces faced minimal opposition from Axis forces, Operation Slapstick dented the Allied forces significantly. The British 1st Airborne Division arrived at the Sea of Taranto on September 9, 1943. The landing was swift and danger-free as there were no German forces present. However, tragedy struck when the British fast mine layer HMS Abdeel hit a hidden mine, causing over 160 casualties for the Allied forces. Despite the landmine incident, Allied forces quickly established a strong foothold in the area. By September 11, the British Corps were in battle and skirmishes with the German 1st Parachute Division. After getting a taste of fierce resistance, Allied forces came out on top. On the same day, the Allied forces freed the ports of Bari and Brindisi from the precarious control of the Italian forces. Prior to the invasion, on August 19, 1943, General Badoglio, the new Italian Prime Minister, had established contacts with General Eisenhower in an attempt to negotiate an unconditional surrender, bypassing German knowledge. The Allied Chief of Staff instructed Eisenhower to accept Italy's surrender and exploit this development to their maximum military advantage. Badoglio requested the Allied powers conduct an airborne assault on Rome to capture the Italian leadership and prevent the Germans from capturing Italy. Eisenhower was convinced, and he ordered the 82nd Airborne Division to deploy on the condition that the Italians secure the airfields and silence the anti-aircraft batteries. But following an audacious intelligence-gathering mission carried out in Rome by top U.S. commanders, this plan was determined to be impractical. On September 7, 1943, U.S. General Maxwell Taylor and Colonel William T. Gardner infiltrated the enemy lines to confer with the Italian leadership. They discovered a significantly reinforced German presence in Rome. Furthermore, with the Italians no longer receiving supplies from the Germans, they had only fuel and ammunition to offer token resistance. Badoglio further confirmed Italy's inability to secure the objectives necessary for an Allied airborne operation in Rome. Hence, the airborne assault on Rome was called off. By September 8th, Italy's unconditional surrender was publicly announced, which meant the airborne assault was no longer necessary. However, it was too late to redirect the 82nd Airborne to its original objective of securing the northern Allied flank at the Salerno landings near the Volturno River. Prior to the invasion, the Allied air forces executed a relentless bombardment campaign throughout southern Italy. Cities like Pisa, Benevento, Salerno, Foggia, and the Brenner Pass felt the brunt of these attacks. Not only did the airborne attacks cripple vital infrastructure, they also disrupted Axis logistics. Additionally, Allied air forces targeted airfields, marshalling yards, communication facilities, and gun positions with the aim of weakening German air defenses. One of these airborne strikes also destroyed the headquarters of German Field Marshal Kesselring, which was situated in Frascati, south of Rome. This relentless aerial assault further derailed German command and control, significantly reduced the threats posed by the Axis fighter aircraft, and also created a critical advantage for when the Allied forces would eventually land. On September 9, 1943, Allied forces assembled at night and converged on the Salerno beaches. Under General Mark Clark's command, the U.S. Fifth Army led Operation Avalanche. The operation also had two separate naval task forces, commanded by Rear Admiral John L. Hall, Jr. and Commodore Jeffrey Oliver. Additionally, the Allies had forces coming from both the northern and southern fronts to join the mainland invasion of Italy. The northern forces consisted of the British X-Corps, spearheaded by the 46th and 56th Infantry Divisions, which had previously been engaged in Sicily and Bizerte, Tunisia. Approaching the 45th Infantry Division from the south was the U.S. Sixth Corps, under the command of the tried-and-true 36th Infantry Division. Last but not least, U.S. and British Rangers were tasked with capturing points of strategic significance. The U.S. Rangers aimed to capture mountain passes leading to the Naples Plain, and the British commandos were tasked with seizing Salerno itself. The Germans knew the Allies were planning a mainland invasion, so they were ready and waiting. Despite achieving initial surprise due to the absence of a preliminary bombardment, Allied forces encountered fierce resistance from the Axis powers upon landing. German armor and artillery attacked the Salerno beaches, inflicting heavy casualties on the landing of Allied troops. General Walker and his 36th divisions were among the ones to face the most brutal defensive fire in the early stages. The American 36th Infantry Division, landing near Paestum, encountered a stiff challenge from elements of the battle-hardened German 16th Panzer Division. Meanwhile, the British X-Corps also faced hard resistance from the Axis forces on the two beaches they landed on. U.S. Rangers and their British commandos had better luck. They faced minimal resistance and ended up securing their designated objectives with relative ease. However, the British 46th and 56th Infantry Divisions received an unwarming welcome at the hands of German forces. These two divisions were made to battle tooth and nail for every inch of ground. By the end of the first day, neither side had a strategic advantage. Although the U.S. forces had clawed their way onto the mainland, their progress fell short of the initial plans. To counter the Axis onslaught, it was necessary for the Allied forces to establish a foothold. Despite the intensity of German counterattacks, the Allied forces managed to establish roughly a 4-mile-deep beachhead by nightfall. The British X-Corps achieved this 4-mile-deep beachhead. However, a critical 5-mile gap remained at the Sella Sea, preventing a unified Allied front. Adding to the tension, German reinforcements began coming in as the Axis powers started unleashing air attacks on the invaded beaches. The Battle of Salerno had well and truly begun. The following day saw a brutal battle between the two sides that ended in a stalemate. With the Allied looking to strengthen their position on the beachhead, the Germans were ready to defend every inch of the soil until the last breath. Allied forces took a deep setback when Admiral Hewitt's flagship, the mighty USS Ancon, became the target of one of the German attacks. This further derailed the Allied progress, and questions were raised about whether the Allied had aerial superiority or the Germans. To counter this, Allied aircraft carriers had to provide additional air cover to the troops on the ground. The initial plan to capture the airfields was looking far off for the Allied forces, as the Germans had held them back, keeping firm control over most of the strategically important locations. The morning of September 11th further worsened the Allied campaign. The Germans began the day by unleashing surprise bombers on the Allied vessels. The Fritz X glide bombs were a new invention at the time, and they crippled the Allied vessels. By the evening, General Clark and his men had to relocate their headquarters ashore, considering the precarious situation. The Germans, on the other hand, continued to reinforce their ranks by adding elements of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division to blister their ranks even further. By the end of the third day of battle, Allied forces had a shortage of manpower. The shortage was so concerning that there were multiple requests sent in for additional troops to be sent. Allied generals Eisenhower and Alexander had anticipated difficulties in the form of 8 German divisions tasked with opposing the beach landings. These 8 divisions were deployed near Rome, Naples, and the south. Hence, Allied forces faced extreme pressure from these 8 divisions in the early going. On September 15th, the famous British 7th Armored Division was called the Desert Rats. It was the Desert Rats who helped the Allied forces counter the Axis panzer units. Over the next 3 critical days, the Allies fought tirelessly to secure and expand their beachhead. All available Allied aircraft were tasked with providing close air support to the ground forces and disrupting German resupply efforts. Additionally, the naval forces pounded heavy naval gunfire on the Germans, further adding to the pressure. The harsh reality of troop limitations had forced Allied forces to adopt a defensive posture. General Clark even considered evacuating under the mounting pressure, especially when the 36th Division was staring down the German barrels later in the afternoon of September 12th. However, there were some positives for the Allied forces too. For instance, by September 12th, a crucial airstrip within the beachhead had become operational. Now the Allied forces could get vital reinforcements and resupply flights from Sicily and Allied aircraft carriers. On September 13th, Allied forces managed to capture the town of Altavilla in the early hours of the morning. However, in the afternoon, the Germans counterattacked in great numbers. The target was the vulnerable boundary between the U.S. 6 Corps and the British 10 Corps. These two divisions had to bear heavy losses as this brutal counterattack shortened their defensive lines. The airborne troops parachuting behind enemy lines was another important tactic used by the Allied forces. On the nights of the 13th and 14th of September, these airborne troops landed behind enemy lines and captured critical positions of significance. In a desperate attempt to bolster the Allied defenses, the battalions of the legendary 82nd Division entered the fray via parachutes. These battalions proved to be the difference makers as they took up the defenses of the U.S. 6 Corps. September 14th saw the tide turn for the first time in the Allied favor in the legendary battle for Salerno. The arrival of the fresh reinforcements proved to be the turning point, as it raised the derailed morale of the battle-ridden soldiers, who had been going hard for 5 long days. With the support of naval gunfire, the reinforced Allied forces repelled any German attempt to penetrate the Allied lines. The airborne divisions unleashed a massive bombing campaign as they rained destruction upon the German positions. As the day wore on, there was a sense of optimism among the Allied forces and generals alike. By September 15th, the fight had entered its 7th day, which turned out to be pivotal in the entire invasion of mainland Italy. Finally, the relentless German offensive strategy had hit its end and was replaced by a more defensive and cautious approach. Several of the Axis divisions, including the 16th Panzer Division, had brought their campaigns to a halt. On the other hand, it was time for the Allied forces to show their hand, and they did so in the most devastating manner. The British countered a German assault on the eastern flank and achieved a critical victory to further solidify their foothold. Allied forces got a further boost when British battleships Warspite and Valiant arrived on the show. On the German side, the cracks were beginning to show. Even the pragmatic leader, General Kesselring, was forced to acknowledge the naval and aerial superiority of the Allied forces. And then the unthinkable happened. General Kesselring recommended breaking up the battle. The dawn of September 16th brought the news the entire Allied campaign had been waiting for. Upon General Kesselring's recommendation, General von Wiedinghoff received the green light to withdraw the German forces. German forces started to leave the areas covered by Allied naval gunfire. Salerno had finally been breached and was firmly under Allied control. Wasting no time after the Battle of Salerno, the Fifth Army continued its march north towards Naples, another key city and a stronghold of the Axis powers. The U.S. Army's recently arrived 3rd Infantry Division led the advance towards Naples. This advance aimed to break through the German defenses. The 3rd Infantry Division led from the front and made light work of the obstacles in its way. On September 22nd, the Allied forces captured the key town of Acerno. On September 28th, the town of Avellino was also captured. These victories paved the way for Allied forces to unleash a direct assault on Naples, as there were no German defenses on the pathway to Naples. In early October, Field Marshal Kesselring convinced Adolf Hitler to defend northern Italy by utilizing the natural defenses of central Italy. The aim was to stop Allied forces from capturing airfields and prolong the campaign. Following Hitler's approval, the Germans established a series of defensive lines across the south of Rome. The establishment of Volturno, Barbara, and most importantly, the Winter Line made it extremely difficult for the Allied to get a hold of southern Italy. The Winter Line in late 1943 came in handy as it managed to successfully stop the Allied advances. In particular, the Fifth Army's push on the Western Front had to bear the brunt of the Winter Line. The Eighth Army made some successful advances at the high cost of Canadian troops. However, the harsh winter weather with blizzards and heavy snow forces made life extremely difficult for both the Allies as their advances reached a standstill by December 1943. As the year turned over, the focus of Allied forces did too. In January 1944, the focus of Allied attacks shifted toward the Western Front. As the efforts of the Allied forces had come to a standstill due to the winter weather, the leaders believed the Western Front would provide them with a better chance of reaching Rome. Winston Churchill advocated for a new operation that involved landing behind the German lines in Anzio to disrupt the Gustav Line defenses. The operation was approved, and the Allied forces began planning the Anzio landings. However, the initial attempts to push inland and cut off German forces stalled due to disagreements between the Allied commanders. There were also a limited number of U.S. troops, and hence an operation as critical would not go on. Between January and May of 1944, Allied forces carried out 4 major offensives, all targeting the Winter Line. In May, Allied commanders decided to combine the 5th and 8th Armies, including British, American, Canadian, Polish, and French forces. These forces were concentrated along a 30-kilometer front between Monte Cassino and the Western Front. And finally, after months and months of standstills and failed attacks, the Winter Line was finally breached. Once the Winter Line was breached, General Clark was ordered to exploit the retreating Germans through the Gustav lines. However, he disobeyed the orders and went to capture the undefended city of Rome. Finally, on June 4, 1944, Allied forces captured Rome after over 11 long months of both direct and indirect fighting. The German 10th Army escaped as the Allied forces took over the capital of Italy and firmly placed their control over the majority of the country. The Axis powers only have a hold on northern Italy now. In the aftermath of capturing Rome, Allied forces shifted their focus towards the north, where the Germans and the Axis powers had firm control. From June to August 1944, Allied forces fought long and hard to capture Florence. On the other side, Polish forces also took over the port city of Ancona. Allied forces launched Operation Olive in pursuit of the Gothic Line, but failed to make big breakthroughs in August 1944. The following winter further derailed the Allied efforts as the harsh weather conditions halted their offensives. As the winter months wore out, the Allied introduced a new strategy for the offensive defense. Operation Encore in February and March of 1945 saw the Allied forces capture the strategic position of Monte Castello and other key destinations. On April 9, 1945, Allied forces launched a new wave of massive bombardment on the Germans and Axis forces in northern Italy. With the help of extensive bombing, by April 18th, the 8th Army had broken through the Argenta Gap and captured Bologna. On the other side, the U.S. 10th Mountain Division reached Po River on April 22, 1945. April 25th saw the declaration of a general uprising by the Italian partisans. Allied forces advanced towards Austria, Milan, and Genoa on the same day. Finally, after having taken heavy losses across Italy, German Army Group C surrendered in April of 1945, marking the end of the Italian campaign for the Allied forces with all of Italy in firm control of them. The Italian campaign and the invasion of Italy by the Allied forces were 2 of the biggest battlegrounds of World War II. Although Italy started off as part of the Axis bloc, it failed to sustain the war and eventually crumbled under heavy economic and logistical pressure. It was imminent that a country of such significance would fall into the hands of the Germans. For the Allied powers, this was far from acceptable, and hence began the invasion of Italy, one of the most gruesome battlegrounds that paved the way for Allied victory in April 1945.